All right, thank Francesco, and thanks everyone for the invitation. I guess I'm not as lucky as Facundo to be there, but man, I'm still very happy to present. This is joint work with Enrique Mendoza, and we've been working on this paper, I guess, or research area for some time. So we've been evolving. This project has been evolving into. We have another paper that we published a couple of years ago. This is a kind of a longer term project, and now we are kind of thinking about extending. So like questions and comments, of course, I'm more than welcome. And I guess because I work at the Fed, the usual disclaimer applies. The views expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So today I'm going to talk about optimal domestic and external sovereign default. I guess before I start, and because Christoph, when he presented earlier today, he was talking about a definition of domestic or foreign debt. Throughout the presentation of what is going to be important for us is who actually holds the debt. So when I'm talking about domestic debt, I'm going to be talking about domestic households or institutions holding the debt. There is a big link between where the debt is issued, the legal framework under which the debt is issued, and who holds the debt. But the definition that we want to use for this paper and that we try to capture is that of who owns the government bond. So as Carmen and Ken documented, and also Hal and Sargent for the US, they are domestic default do happen. There were 68 outright defaults since 1750 in industrial and developing countries, and by outright defaults I mean forced conversions and reduced coupon payments. And there are several statistics that that come out from this data that are important. So one of them, and I guess is the reason why a large literature focused for a long time on external defaults rather than on domestic defaults, is that these domestic defaults are less frequent. So it's a 1-to-3 ratio. But what you also see is that most or all domestic defaults are also external. So in most of or all cases that were analyzed, you see that when there is a domestic default, that results also in an external default. Domestic debt is also is important, I guess, because you represent a large fraction of public debt, and that is more important for developed economies, in which it represents about 2/3 on average. And public debt, I guess, that something that is has in common with external default is that public debt and spreads, they rise sharply before default. And I guess a recent case is what happened during the crisis in Europe in 2012, 2013, 2014.
So Pablo, can I ask you a quick question about the definitions in here? So when you mean external and domestic, you mean currency, or you have another measure that says you're defaulting in people, in local holders? It's just
local. You can take a local and local holders and foreign holders. That's kind of definition we have in mind.
Okay, it's not the currency. Okay.
It's not the currency. I mean, they are. I guess if you want, there are several ways you can define domestic debt. Mm-hmm. At the end, many of if you can look at the statistics across these different definitions, coming up with a measure of who owns the debt is hard. There was this data that we used from the IMF, who did a fantastic work about documenting that. Carmen has done some of that. I think Christoph also has data on that. They are correlated. So in some sense, it is the case that most of the domestic currency debt is in hands of domestic holders, and most of the debt that is issued under domestic law ends up in the balance sheet of domestic financial institutions or in pension funds in the country. But but they are not the same. So today, the way I want you to think about this is just a domestic as who owns the debt, who owns the debt, and is the guy who lives within the country, and importantly, is the kind of people who enters into the welfare function of the government. Now, as I was saying, the Eurozone, the crisis, we can think of that as a domestic default, with some caveats, I guess. Something very important, and that's the reason why we want to think about this a little bit like that, is because most of the Eurozone public debt is held within Europe. So that is true when you look at the Eurozone as a block, or if you go country by country. So we have data across countries. On average, that's, as I said, is close to 2/3. The other one is that the common currency rules out unilateral inflation as a factor of default. So basically, if I want to think about any country in the Eurozone as the two options or the two ways you can default on the debt or renege on payments on sovereign debt, if it's issuing in your own currency, is that you can inflate it away, or you can unilaterally default. Given that these countries are part of the Eurozone and the ECB is making monetary policy decisions, that kind of rules out this unilateral inflation as default. The other I think issue that is important is that the EU institutions worry about the effects of member default across the Eurozone. So the redistribution, it was something that was very prevalent in the news or in the commentaries around the European the crisis, when basically the common thing that we heard during the time was this thing about the Greek households and the German bondholders, and what was the kind of the relationship between the two, and why we would why German taxpayers could bail out Greece or Italy or Spain or other countries in problem. So the other thing you see in this European crisis is that the facts kind of align with the facts that Reinhard and Rogoff documented, in the sense that their ratio spreads rose sharply during the in the period, and there was, I mean, there was only one default, if you want, the Greece default, but many of these countries were in trouble as spreads rise considerably in the period that went from 2012 to 2014. The one important caveat, and I said, and this is not a minor caveat, but so then when you look at the model, you can think about a particular country or as a Eurozone, but the Eurozone is not a fiscal union. So fiscal decisions or even default are still done at the country level. So that's kind of the one thing where when we look at the model, we're going to present the calibration that basically looks at at something that resembles an average European country, as opposed to the Eurozone as a block, basically for this reason. So like fiscal things that have to do with tax policies and the decision to default are still done at the country level. So what are we going to do in this paper? Is that we're going to propose a framework to explain domestic defaults. The basic framework is, you can think about a Bewley or Nagliari economy with aggregate shocks and default risk. So the agents in this economy are going to be facing idiosyncratic shocks. There's going to be also added uncertainty coming from aggregate shocks, and the decisions that the government take will basically affect the entire economy. We're going to analyze how the government makes optimal debt and default choices, trading off these distribution incentives versus the endogenous default cost. So we're gonna show, I'm gonna try to present the intuition about this, that there are important distribution incentives that come with the social value of debt, for self-insurance, liquidity, and risk sharing among domestic households. So there's gonna be a distribution of households who have access to this government debt market, and some of the holdings of the debt are going to basically be used for self-insurance, and liquidity, and also to smooth consumption. So that when the government is deciding on whether to default or not, and what are the other policies is taking, is making is taking that into account, and that induces an endogenous default cost into the model that is a little bit that goes farther from the that moves from the standard external default literature, where basically the incentives have to do with low domestic consumption and foreign lenders. Of course, as I said, since we have the most of domestic defaults happen together with external defaults in a quantitative model, we have a model we're gonna have domestic borrowers and also foreign domestic holders of the debt, but also foreign lenders. So we're gonna solve for this recursive Markov equilibrium with a commitment, and then we're gonna kind of present these time series features of the model, looking at long-run properties to see whether the model aligns with what we see in the data. We're gonna discuss default events and the business cycle correlations as a way to test whether the model is consistent with what we see in the data. And then we're gonna out of there we're gonna present some analysis of the mechanism using kind of the equilibrium functions and try to provide intuition of why how these domestic default happen and why that happened, and trying to understand the mechanism behind what we see in the previous analysis. So what do we find?
Pablo, just one question. So are you going to talk about the cross-country differences in domestic holding and what determines this, or this is outside the scope of this paper?
No, so yeah, so I guess so in the paper, basically we collect data. When I get to calibration, maybe I can. There are differences across countries. So we work with data for the Eurozone, and at the end, our calibration is going to be for something that looks like a representative European country, and then we also do a calibration for Spain as an individual. We could have calibrated for every country in the Eurozone of different domestic debt ratios, different level of spreads, and that would imply different, I guess, as I'm going to show you, different degrees of, like the government, having different value for redistribution and so on. But what I'm going to show you today is going to be something like a representative European country, and the underlying data to calibrate this, is basically based, is the country level data aggregated using GDP weighted measures. But yeah, so I guess in short, I'm gonna abstract from cross-country heterogeneity. What we're gonna have is within this represented country heterogeneity between bondholders and non-bondholders. We also gonna have these, foreign lenders. But I'm not gonna have a multi-country setup, if you want.
I see. And then the follow-up question is, you're not interested into the feedback effects of the default decision on the domestic versus foreign holding, I guess, or yes?
So I guess so. Yes. So they are. We are interested, I guess, the way but we are not doing it in this paper. Okay. I guess so. I think what you're thinking is, let's say if Greece defaults, or if Italy, let's say Italy or Spain default, that are much larger countries. Then there's going to be an impact on the German economy, and that would kind of, would feed into kind of the dynamics of the model. Yeah, we are abstracting from that in that paper, but it's not because we are not interested. It's just because the model, as we are solving, this is kind of one first attempt to do it this dynamically with this endogenous distribution of domestic agents. We're just abstracting from that at this stage, I would say.
I see. No, what I had in mind was just for domestic households, if they take into the account the history of past defaults for their decision to hold domestic or foreign debt.
Oh yes. I mean, so we're gonna look at a Markov equilibrium, and when deciding on where to hold the debt or not, basically the households understand that there is a spread and the government is likely to default on their holdings of debt. So yeah, they incorporate that. I mean, the history per se, I guess, it comes with the calibration of this within country. In some sense, if I go country by country, there are going to be parameters that might change, like the discount factor or kind of this, something that's going to be affecting the welfare rates of the government. All that comes built into this calibration. But within the equilibrium, the households understand that at different stages or different state of the world, with different levels, the government might default. Now, given all the other parameters, the government might default on their holdings of the debt, and given that, they decide on whether to hold more or less of this government debt.
Okay.
So, and let me ask you a question, Pablo. Sorry.
Yes.
Thinking about interpretation, you say you are like calibrating like a representative European Union country, right?
Yes.
So the interpretation is like the whole Europe defaulting. It's not like because you say this liquidity effect. Suppose in Italy I default. Okay, the Italian bonds are not gonna provide liquidity, but I can use the Germans or I can use the French that they didn't default. So the interpretation is gonna be the whole Europe defaulting.
Well, so I think interpretation is, let me get into the model and then we can talk about interpretation. Interpretation is that this representative European country defaults. In the baseline model, we're gonna, let me tell you about the model, but like in the most basic model, we're gonna consider where there is only this one asset. Basically, there is this the government bond that households have access to, and then they can they have other sources of income, but the asset is that government bond. Now we extend the model in the paper, I guess, because I want to focus on the trade-off of the domestic default and how inequality affects that trade-off. But you can think that everything I'm going to present today holds even if the households have access to another asset. Now, it's going to be important what is this other asset, whether it's a risk-free bond or it's a risky productive technology. So that will change basically the different debt levels at which the government will default, but qualitatively the results of the model will extend to the version of the model where there is either a risk-free bond or an asset that is as risky, let's say, as equity as government debt.
Even when there is portfolio heterogeneity along the wealth distribution.
So in the so I guess in the paper we have a section where we're using data. I'm forgetting the name of the data. I think it's the household survey that the ECB provides, where you can look at basically kind of holdings of households. We compute we look at the wealth of Gini and so on. And the model is consistent with those statistics. The one caveat with that data, and that's why maybe I should defer that to the calibration, but is that it's hard to construct indirect, I guess, holdings of government bonds, because kind of bonds who are in pension. So like it's very clear when bonds are in hands. We see the bonds in the balance sheet of a bank, but we don't. Many cases we don't know whether that is actually bond holdings of the bank itself, or just like customers who own the bond through the bank, or like in pension funds and so on. So the caveat with the data is that, but yeah. So we do look at kind of wealth, the distribution, and how that when in this extension of the model where we incorporate another asset and another sources of income, we look at basically and trying to separate what is bond holdings. So there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity even in terms of asset of wealth, and within wealth levels there's going to be also heterogeneity in terms of who holds the bonds. That in general, basically they are concentrated at the very top of distribution, with the caveat that the retirement accounts and so on, that's very hard capture. So maybe I went too much into the details, but we do try to get into heterogeneity within the wealth distribution.
Thanks.
Okay, let me just defer a little bit the questions until we get to the environment, and I'm happy to keep answering this, and please ask again if you feel I have an answer once I present the rest of the model. So no, something that's going to be very important is that there's going to be this rich feedback dynamics linking the distribution of bond holdings, the dispersion of individual default gains, something that is an endogenous object, and the default incentives and default risks. So like basically, along the business cycle, the wealth distribution is going to be changing. With that, the welfare gains, the individual gains of default or repayment are going to be changing. And with that, the incentives of the government to default, and there's going to be this feedback mechanism and affecting the default decision of the government. And of course, it's not only default, but also how much debt the government wants to issue, and with that, basically the level of redistributions through taxes and transfers, which are also endogenous in the model. So we find that the model consistent with mean and pre-crisis ratios of total domestic and external debt, and some of the cyclical movements and feature of debt crisis dynamics. So I'm going to show you some of these correlations, who are also based on the individual country level data now aggregated to this representative country. Now we observe that debt exhibits protected fluctuations with zero or low probability of default in normal times. Basically, you see something like the Eurozone pre-crisis, where like most countries will be paying something very close to risk-free, and then the crisis are relatively sudden, in which spreads kind of spike prior to a default, or just to for a few periods during something that we can associate with the debt crisis. The model is qualitatively robust to parameter variations. I'm gonna discuss some of these, but I don't think I have time to go into details on all of them. The incorporation of progressive taxation. So we're going to show you a particular tax function, but we also analyze how changes in the level of progressivity would affect the default incentives of the government, which depend on the distribution of wealth. Or we also look at partial default. This I guess is similar to what in the way that Facundo, in some sense, like in our baseline, we have full default and you re-enter with no debt, but we'll consider one instance where there is partial default. So basically, the government is allowed here to choose the fraction of debt in which is defaulting. And this case is also important, I guess, because from a modeling point of view, you can think also that the framework can be used also to look at optimal inflation, in the sense. So if you were to look at a country where it's issuing debt in its own currency, that is not the case in Europe, but a country that is issuing debt in its own currency would be looking at kind of the level of inflation as a way to partially default on the debt. So this case resembles a country like that. And then, as I mentioned before, the baseline I'm going to present today only considers simple balance sheet structure for the households, but the results are robust to the inclusion of additional assets. And now quantitatively, and the calibration will change depending on the level of risk of this additional asset, whether you make it a risk-free asset or you make it something like equity. Okay, and I guess there's been so at the time, I guess when we started with this project, there were not many papers in this literature. Now there's been a significant increase in the literature looking at domestic. I guess we still contributing to the literature in that we are kind of one of the few considering this redistribution feedback mechanism between between the government default decision and the wealth distribution. So let me go into the model setup, which is relatively simple. So we introduce non-state contingent government bonds, B, with a default option in a Bewley model with aggregate risk. So the underlying structure of the model is one where agents are going to face idiosyncratic income shocks, Y. They're going to be aggregate government expenditure shocks, G, and the households can save in government bonds with the standard, I guess, no borrowing constraint. So the government is going to pay for G using government debt B, lump sum transfers tau, with income taxes tau Y, and by issuing debt B prime at price Q, which is going to be determined endogenously. So government expenditures G are this kind of source of aggregate uncertainty. Y is the source of idiosyncratic uncertainty, and then you have the choice of the government in terms of debt, default, and taxes, which are going to be, and transfers, which are going to be affecting the equilibrium dynamics. The debt is going to be sold to both domestic creditors, these households, and the risk-neutral foreign investors, which I mean, from a data point of view, that makes it kind of brings the model close to the data, as only 2/3 of the data is tends to be on average domestic. Some countries more, some countries less. But from a modeling point of view, having this risk-neutral foreign investor helps us in a relatively simple way pin down the price of the debt, which with the right state variables looks a lot like the pricing of debt in the external default literature. The government is going to default if the welfare under default exceeds that under repayment, and when considering whether to default or not, and also how much debt to issue, the government is going to be taking into account the household heterogeneity. So the timing of the actions are as follows. So the period T is going to begin, then you're going to have the realization of the shocks, the idiosyncratic income Y and the aggregate shocks G. So that's going to lead to individual states, B and Y. Basically, B is chosen at the individual level in the previous period. That leads to a distribution of bonds and income, gamma T. So we're going to have this distribution that evolves over time, and aggregate states B and G unknown. So income taxes are going to be paid, and at the time the government makes a default decision. So if the government chooses not to default, then basically the debt market opens. The government sets the supply of debt and transfers and set the transfers of taxes that satisfy the government budget constraint. As I said, here we have this transfer and income taxes that are proportional in this baseline version of the model, and then the government budget constraint basically is one where this transfer of or lump sum taxes, depending on the sign, are equal to tax revenues minus the government debt that is repaying minus government expenditures, plus the resources from borrowing. If the government defaults, it's going to face an income cost fee. So basically, and it's going to lose access to the debt market only in that period, and the transfers are going to satisfy basically that they're basically equal to the revenues for income taxes net of the government expenditure shock. After that decision, basically the agents consume and period T ends. So if you understood the timing, I think there is not much to say when presenting the problem of the household. So this is a problem of an individual household where basically it's taking into account that the government can default on the debt or not default on the debt. So basically this continuation value basically depends on whether the government has defaulted or not. And so this is not chosen by the household, but it's chosen by the government. Condition that the government decision, basically the household is going to make the standard consumption saving decision, whether basically it's choosing how much to save, given the level of taxes and transfers in the economy, its income level, and how much is basically the government repaying in terms of previous savings. And together, by looking at the price function Q, basically the government, the household is going to be choosing how much to save B prime. So if the government decide to default, basically the household, the consumption of the household, basically is going to equal, the government debt market, it's going to be closed. So the household consumption is going to be equal basically to the income net of the transfers and this default cost, which basically makes clear that in the case of a government default, basically the household is losing the previous their previous savings in terms of wealth. The other thing to note is that we're gonna be introducing this default cost here, but a feature of the model is that we once you introduce household heterogeneity, we're gonna be able to sustain that even without default cost. So in this dynamic setup, even if I were to set this function to 0, the government would be willing to to hold some debt in equilibrium just because there are benefits of redistribution that come through government debt and the liquidity it provides. I'm gonna
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
A question, Pablo. So I guess you're assuming here, and you probably said this already, that this is the only asset that households have access to for self-insurance. In particular, there are no markets that one household can insure another household. I guess that's your assumption here. But I think one way to, I guess, rationalize this it might be that when there are defaults. So basically, when there are defaults, there's no way of self-insurance or of the insuring between the households at all because there's no asset. But you would think that government defaults hurt banking systems. And so that is going to basically reduce the degree to which households can use redistribution when the government defaults. And so maybe this is just sort of an extreme version of that in terms of just the default sort of eliminating completely any financial markets. But I think that, maybe later or at some point, I'm not sure, thinking about this complementarity between the degree to which households can redistribute privately and insure privately versus with the government, and how that changes with default and not default is sort of like probably important for what your results.
Yes. So I completely agree. I guess you can think of this default as a case where a government default basically wipes out a financial market in this structure of the model where when there is only one asset. We do analyze in an extension of the model. I guess that I'm not presenting today, but like what would happen if households would have access to a different asset that that's not subject, that you can keep even after the government default. So like it's a mix, something like you are holding a German bond and you have access to the bond because the banks, I guess, you have it in a German bank or in a bank that is outside the country default or the government default is not affecting the financial institutions in a way that make them fail with the default, and so the incentives to default do change, but the I guess the key takeaway from there is that the wealth distribution tends to be concentrated almost in any dimension that you look at. So like if you look at whether there's going to be this dichotomy here, if you want, between bondholders and non-bondholders, that will still hold as you add another layer or another financial asset or another asset in general. So then while the incentives to default are going to be reduced, and because the benefit of redistributing with the default are going to come down, the fact that the wealth distribution remains highly skewed, or there are states in the world where the distribution becomes very skewed, a lot of the things go through. And then once you calibrate the model to kind of rematch the spreads and the debt levels we see in the data, then the dynamics of the model are not affected as much. But yes, so I completely agree, and thanks for the comment.
We should have data on how much individual household insurance goes down in states when the government defaults, right? I mean, there should be household surveys in countries that have defaulted.
Yes, so I guess I guess the one I'm aware, with heterogeneity. I mean, you have in the US, for example, the sort of consumer finances. In Europe, you have this, the survey that is done, I think, every 3 years by, is provided at the ECB that we use. The problem with that, I guess, at this stage, so like the frequency of that is not at the frequency where you can really, do time series comparisons. I mean, you can look at these screenshots, but with the data at hand, yeah, so it would be, there are data limitations when it comes to wealth redistribution and the links to the business cycle, or basically default events. For one, default events are not they do not happen as often, especially in countries where you have access to the data. And then the other is that these surveys are generally costly, so they're performed every 3 or 4 years, which prevents, I guess, we do look at the over time and what happens, after this crisis, but like and we do have some regulations in the paper where we link kind of wealth Ginies and spreads, and there is a link there, but with the caveat that the frequency of this data and in which countries you have access to the data is relatively limited. Yeah. So the government default decision, I guess, yeah. So if there are no other questions, I'll continue into the government default decision. We consider as Bandari, Evans, Kolosov, Sargent, and we're gonna start with this because that we're gonna simplify, greatly the solution of the model, where the government uses these welfare weights omega that basically depend on the bond holdings and income, and basically using those welfare weights, the government is gonna integrate basically the individual value of continuing, without default or continuing with the default. Basically, kind of is gonna integrate this function and this function, and given the aggregate value W of continue with no default or continue with default, the government is gonna choose whether to default or not. And I guess this is the functional form of the welfare weights we start with. Then we're gonna consider an array of welfare weights, including one that matches the wealth distribution. But for that, the solution method changes greatly, so that's kind of why we start with this simple version. The other thing that is important is that at every point in time, even if when the government is choosing not to default, then it comes, it has to choose the debt level. That debt level is gonna be chosen by to also maximize aggregate welfare. So here what we need to do is to consider something that it looks a lot like a one period deviation problem of the household, basically where the household can evaluate basically what would be their indirect utility from different debt levels, B prime, not the equilibrium one. Take into account that how that changes the dynamics of the equilibrium in the future periods, but also the price function today, and with that my saving, the household saving decision and taxes today. So once we have defined this function B tilde, basically then again the government can integrate this B tilde and maximize over B prime. So every time the government chooses not to default, then it's going to move into the stage where for every household we're going to evaluate what is the continuation value of different levels of the equilibrium, and then with that at hand we're going to determine the equilibrium choice by maximizing average welfare. So, with that, I guess we can define, a couple of things that are going to be relevant in what I'm going to show you in the next, I guess, 10 minutes I have. So, we're gonna call these individual gains from default. Basically, are something that is like a consumption equivalent alpha, and alpha, is going to be higher, the more you would prefer the default, and the social welfare gain from default. That is very is tightly linked to the default decision. Basically, it's gonna be the integral of that. So I'm gonna show you pictures that have to do with this, and basically that is the average welfare gain from default. So as I said, the bond pricing condition, provided the marginal buyer of the debt is a foreign investor, basically it's gonna be a simple pricing function as in external sovereign debt models. Take into account all this default and the distribution. Importantly, if once the foreign lenders are the marginal buyer, basically that prevents, that helps us in that the wealth distribution doesn't enter the price function, provided we have together with the welfare weights. The welfare weights are embedded into this, but the wealth distribution doesn't enter as long as we don't have to clear the price out of the internal market, but it's pinned down by the external lenders.
The default
So
probability doesn't
quantitatively,
depend on the distribution?
the what?
The default probability does not depend on the distribution?
Yeah, so it's gonna depend through these welfare weights, and the same the debt. So and that's all embedded. I guess that's all behind so it's all embedded into these W's. You see these omegas. I mean, it's all embedded into that, and the same for this choice. But once you have this the problem set out like this, then there's no additional state variable to consider, because once the foreign lender is the marginal buyer, you don't need to pin down the price. Basically, you can pin down the price by this zero profit condition, and not by a market clearing condition that says that domestic bond holdings have to be equal to the supply of bonds. And that's what I was trying to say.
Sorry, Pablo. So I not sure understood. Okay, sorry about that. If you want, I skip my question. No. I was thinking, I mean, they are going to price fairly the probability that you default, and the probability depends on the distribution. That's what I don't understand, right? Even if the price is neutral and it's external, that probability depends on the distribution, and then you should the external holder should keep track of the distribution, or hence the economy should keep track of the distribution.
That's exactly my question.
Yeah, I
Yes.
don't know if I understood your answer.
Sorry, I think
Okay.
it's a good.
What? No, I'm following in Tobias' question. I think I didn't understand the answer. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So let me explain it better. So once you make, so there are two assumptions that are important for the result. One is this assumption about the welfare weights. So once you these welfare weights might be different than the actual distribution, but they allow us to aggregate the value of the individual household. So once you have you are with me that we have these welfare weights who might be gamma. So in which case, if the welfare weights are gamma, then gamma is a state variable, and then as gamma changes over time. But once omega are basically given, let's say in this version of the model by this function I'm defining here. Basically, once you know omega, basically, and the foreign lender is the marginal investor, you don't need to keep track of the distribution.
Okay, so basically it's like you are using, okay, it's exogenous. This thing is exogenous, so the default probability is also exogenous in some way in the distribution. Sorry, I think now I...
No, the default is endogenous and is taking into account the value, so the individual value of the default, that changes with the state, and that affects the default decision. So what is going to be different is that the weights I'm using during the simulation of the model to decide on how much weight they put to each of these individual weights, that is given by this function omega. And so in this version, in this version of the model where omega is given by this functional form, then basically omega, if you want, is a state variable that we don't write in every function, but it's once you basically everyone incorporates omega, including the foreign lenders. I guess maybe we should write this as as omega, and then when omega is equal to gamma, omega is that's what you keep track of, and then but if it's gamma, then you have gamma as a state variable.
Okay. Tricky. Okay, thank you.
But it's not only that. So it's not only the omega assumption that helps you in that dimension. The other one is that you need these foreign lenders kind of to be, to demand some positive portion of the debt, because even if you were to make an assumption of the omega assumption, so if the market would be, if this would be a closed economy where all the debt would be held inside, you would still need the distribution to clear the market, even with the omega. So you need the two assumptions to basically reduce the state space and then get have omega only as a state variable. Okay. And so I guess there are two properties. So how much time do we have? I'm out of time already, or?
A little bit. I would say like 3-4 minutes more, and then we open the floor to discussion.
Okay. So yeah, I went too slow, I guess. So there are different properties. I'm gonna go quickly over the properties and then jump into the results. So the one that is very important is that when making my consumption saving decision, the households are taking into account that with some probability the government might default on the debt, and that is affecting basically the marginal utility, the expected marginal utility of consumption or saving. So then that will affect basically the saving decision, and with that the evolution of the wealth distribution. The other one is that you can rearrange when we have lump sum transfers, you can rearrange the household's budget constraint to redefine something that we call B tilde, basically that is the net bond holdings of the household. So like you can have net savers or net borrowers, and then depending on where you are, basically the default is going to affect you in one way or the other. So if you are a net saver, the default is going to hurt your consumption, and if you're a net borrower, that's going to basically help your consumption. And the way it's going to help your consumption is basically in two ways. And one, it's almost like you're receiving a transfer, a direct transfer from the government. But the other one is that even if the government doesn't default, by increasing the level of debt, it's almost like it's relaxing the borrowing limit of the household, because it's making these transfers to the households, and with that basically it's pushing you to a way to be like a larger net borrower, net saver, and then with that it allows you to kind of borrow more. I guess so I'm gonna the other one I guess that is important when looking at the consumption, the difference in consumption, is that the dispersion of bond holdings is gonna matter, and here there are two things that are important. So like as a planner who cares about their households who are risk averse, the dispersion of current consumption is gonna basically increase incentives to default, because the default basically wipes out the wealth that you see in the economy. So there is this level effect, but then the default will reduce consumption dispersion, so that would increase the incentive to default. But at the same time, has the dynamics incentives change, because all the households who are at a particular point either savers or wanted to save are going to be affected by the default decision, since the government is wiping out the debt. Okay, so and I guess we explore the distribution incentives in a two-period model, and then the social value of the debt. I'm gonna just jump to that. So as I said, we calibrate the model to a to a representative Eurozone country, where we match the ratio of domestic debt. That is about 55%. Here should say the Eurozone spread. And the debt to GDP ratio. Now you can think of this as a service to GDP. And then we look at what the model does in terms of the crisis. So you see that in stars are the moments we target. So there are no much value on saying that the model does well in that dimension. But then we see that the model does well when looking at basically at the peak of the crisis in terms of changes to government debt, changes to domestic debt, changes to the ratio of bond holdings to the ratio of domestic debt to total debt. And now here we see the dynamics of a default. I guess as in the data we see that they are accompanied, like a typical default event, it's accompanied by increase in total debt. This is the red line. As the government becomes more constrained, the debt starts to decline a little bit prior to default. Together with increasing debt, there is an increase in both foreign and domestic. And as we approach default, the domestic debt keeps increasing, but the foreign starts to decline, slightly. This is less than in the data, but you still see dynamics that are consistent with the data. And together with this, we see the sharp increase in spreads, prior to default, and then in the yellow is default. Here we have the value for the average, value of default. So I'm gonna skip that. I'm gonna just finish with this slide and then jump to my conclusion slide. There is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the value of default. When the government is aggregating, as I said before, using this omega, but then it's aggregating these individuals came from default that change a lot depending on the area state and the individual state. So you see that the higher the alpha, remember, is the more you like default. So there is a big change between conditional, let's say, on a level of government expenditure. There is a big change in terms of whether you are you don't hold debt or you hold some of the government debt. So of course, agents who are non-bond holders prefer a default than agents that are holding debt. The other one that is important is heterogeneity in terms of at the income level and wealth. So on one hand you have high wealth, high income agents who would be hurt by default, because you're destroying their wealth, but also killing their saving opportunities. You have the low income and low wealth agents who will benefit from a default because they cannot save because the income is low and they don't have any wealth, so they do not suffer much. But then you have like all the intermediate values where you have these combinations of high wealth and low income. Basically, you are killing, you are hurting agents who save for their idiosyncratic bad times, but you're defaulting right at that time, so that they're hurt a lot. And then you have agents with high income by low wealth who, are not suffering much from the default itself in terms of the wealth they have, but you are defaulting in a period where they would like to save or store some of the income into this the government bond. So then they also suffer from a default. And this is the I guess I'm gonna just
Can I ask a question? I'll ask a question.
Yes.
So on the policy functions on the past and the exercise, I think it would be interesting to look at volatility, aggregate shocks to the volatility of idiosyncratic earnings. Of course, there's sort of a large evidence that during recessions, dispersion of earnings increases. And in the context of your model, that is going to make, if I understand it correctly, sort of give an incentive to the, sort of highlight your mechanism, mainly that when there's a lot of inequality, it increases the default incentives for the government. So potentially, right? So just having this shock as sort of the aggregate shock as the second moment shock can be sort of consistent with the data and highlight your mechanism. So that would be sort of an interesting, thing to consider here. I don't think it will be so difficult necessarily to add that as an aggregate shock.
Yes. No. Thanks. Yes, that's a very good suggestion. Thanks. That'll be, and as you said, I think, so if with the cycle you also see an increase in dispersion, that would increase incentives of the government to default, or at least to redistribute. And with that, you have this tension between either increasing the transfers or leading to a default. That's a good point.
The default incentive, doesn't that depend mainly on the dispersion of wealth, where an increase in the dispersion of income would increase the incentives to save and reduce your bond holdings, so increases the gains from having bonds available?
But what I was thinking is, if you have the richer, one way to bring down the distribution of consumption is by defaulting, because it basically eliminates the wealth of the rich. So if you have, that's. I guess it would be interesting to consider it, but.
An increase in the dispersion of incomes should increase the value of having assets available, no? So it should reduce the default incentive.
No, yes, but at the same time will increase the dispersion of consumption, right? So it
then the marginal gain from reducing the dispersion of consumption is increased. Yes.
So I think there is a trade-off there. So so as you increase when I do, let's say, the steady-state comparison, we increase the dispersion of income, not over the business cycle, but just in this steady-state versus steady-state, or stochastic steady-state versus stochastic steady-state, that increases incentives of the households to save, and that will reduce basically the incentives to default. But at the same time, you have that change in this income dispersion leads to higher consumption dispersion, which in some states of the world might actually increase incentives to default. So I think that there is a trade-off there, and the fact that happens over the business cycle. So when basically the marginal utility of consumption is higher, basically, then that might lead. So I think it's an interesting question, and it doesn't go one way or the other. I guess you have a trade-off there.
So I think we are about to be running out of the time. So we have already addition to the discussion, so that's fine. So if you want just to conclude, and then maybe we take just
I would just end here. If any final question, I guess we just consider, just to reinforce what I said, we consider this feedback mechanism between wealth distribution and the default choice. The quantitative model seems to be in line with our features of the data, and thank everyone for the questions. We consider many extensions of this basic model in the paper, but I'll stop here and then let anyone, if you have a final question, or just move to the next paper, depending on what Francesco.
Thank you, Pablo. So let's see if there is one last question from the floor.
I actually have a question. It's Clara. Hi. So I was wondering if there's any particular reason why you didn't pick an OLG model for the households rather than infinitely lived, because it seems maybe more natural if redistribution is important in this context, that there can maybe arise a trade-off between old and young.
So there are two short answers to that. So as a starting point, we started with the standard, I guess, a model just to keep the model simple. But to be honest, I guess and that's it's something that we are kind of considering in doing. It's just that it is hard to. The data on pensions and how, the composition in terms of bond holdings. That's kind of there will be the first step in terms of kind of analyzing an OLG model. So definitely agree that consider that structure is something that we really interesting. At the time, for simplicity, we started like this, but then later on, we also kind of face these constraints in terms of the data and trying to disentangle, which I think is crucial because a lot of these pension funds are basically composed by government bonds. So doing that is a project itself, and I think it will be super interesting. Yes.
Okay, thanks.